to this Azusa Pacific Seminary webinar, Coronavirus Unmasked, Scientists and Theologians in Dialogue. I'm Brian Luhioyo, Professor of Theology and Ethics at Azusa Pacific Seminary, and I will be your moderator for this conversation. When COVID first appeared, we responded by hoarding toilet paper and canned goods. But now, 7 months on, we know more and are in the process of negotiating what's next. Disaster specialists approach major disasters like this global pandemic in 6 phases. And according to their schema, we are in the disillusionment phase. This is the longest phase. It is in this phase where people start questioning the hopes they might have had in government and disaster assistance. People are more stressed and mental health seems to decline during this stage. Today, also, the only thing Americans agree on is that we are tired of the coronavirus. And add to our situations the racial injustice that we witness, radical unemployment, and a polarizing election. We're not only exhausted and experiencing a barrage of different emotions, we might be beginning to lose hope. And this is why we thought it would be a good idea to gather these committed Christian scholars to have an interdisciplinary conversation about life in the middle of this pandemic. Each of our panelists today have been asked to prepare a 5 to 6 minute reflection from their areas of expertise to help set the trajectory of our dialogue. These 5-minute appetizers, they're short, will hopefully spur on a thoughtful and helpful conversation. So let me briefly introduce our panelists, who are all from Azusa Pacific University. Professor Sarah Richert is a professor of biology and studied virology as a postdoc fellow at the University of Alberta. She also has researched the history of public responses to vaccines. Professor Robert Welsh is the Dean of the School of Behavioral and Applied Sciences at APU and is a professor of psychology, and his research areas focus on forensic psychology. Karen Winslow is a professor of the Old Testament at Azusa Pacific Seminary, and her expertise includes early Judaism and the formation and interpretation of Scripture. We are very glad to have you all here today in this forum for what no doubt will be a robust conversation. Thanks for being here. And thank you to thanks to all of you who are joining us from Zoom and on Facebook Live. We will begin with Professor Sarah Richert, then move on to Robert Welsh, and then Karen Winslow, and then I will follow with my own comments before moving on to a wider conversation. There's a Q&A button for those of you who are in Zoom, so you can submit questions there. And if you're on Facebook, you can post questions there too. We hope to address some of those as we continue in this webinar. So with that, I'd like to begin by asking Dr. Richert to start.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I thought I would just start by answering or maybe going through a few questions that most people ask me as a virologist. They tend to ask me science questions. And if you haven't had a chance to keep up with the news, 2 areas of interest are treatments for COVID-19 and vaccines. So I thought I'd give you a little bit of background, just a quick primer, if you will. I'm going to share my screen. Got a couple slides here. All right, so what I first just wanted to share with you was a little bit about the virus infection process. So you have our virus, by the way, that causes COVID-19, we call it SARS-CoV-2. And SARS-CoV-2 infects respiratory tract tissue, which you can kind of see in this upper left here. The virus uses a receptor on the cell called ACE2. You might have heard about that in the news. But I kind of wanted to explain a little bit about how some of the treatments work. So a treatment you'd use if somebody's infected. They already have the virus in their body, it's replicating, and you have a treatment. And so this has been in the news last week when President Trump received treatment for COVID-19. The first treatment that you may have heard about is remdesivir. That's the first one down here. And remdesivir is actually developed for Ebola virus. but was sort of co-opted for SARS-CoV-2. And what it does is it helps slow down replication of the virus. So a person's infected, the virus is replicating, and remdesivir will help stop the replication. So I got a little X on these viruses within the cell. The other treatment that we heard about was Regeneron, which were antibodies. And the antibodies are something that we normally make as part of an immune response, but you can also take antibodies from a person or another source and transfuse them into a person. And then what those antibodies do, which is kind of signified by these little Ys, the antibodies will block the virus from going to infect new cells. Finally, the dexamethasone, which is not really a COVID-19 specific treatment, it's a steroid hormone that helps to suppress the immune system, the inflammatory response. So it's anti-inflammatory, and that helps with breathing. So sometimes the severe disease that happens with COVID-19 has to do with the immune response in the lungs that can restrict breathing. So that's to help, it's an anti-inflammatory. So those are treatments that we can use for when a person is infected, but I do want to point out that both remdesivir and Regeneron antibodies, they also help in further transmission because they're helping one person lower the amount of virus. It's then less likely that they will be spreading to other people. So it does help in prevention as well. Then the other thing is that I wanted to talk about just is our prevention methods. These, of course, are meant to protect people, to slow down transmission so that people don't develop disease to begin with. And we're living this reality. These are everyday precautions we're taking now. Masks, hopefully we were hand washing daily before, but we're a little more cognizant of that. And social distancing, and all of those are meant to slow down the prevention of the spread of the disease. To aid in prevention to slow down the transmission of the disease. So we're kind of anxiously awaiting for vaccines. And from the very beginning, a lot of public health people said we're not going to have a normal life until we have some vaccines developed. So I just wanted to very quickly catch you up. There are actually five vaccine candidates that are being supported in the United States. 4 of them are already in clinical trial stage 3 clinical trials. And of them, all of them target a very specific part of the virus called the spike protein. That's the protein that helps the virus get into those respiratory cells in the first place. So none of them contain live or even dead SARS-CoV-2, just parts of the virus. And of the four vaccines that are closest to being prepared, those 3 out of 4 of them have multi-dose regimens. So that's important to know that if you get the first shot, you're not going to have complete immunity. And the other thing I wanted to point out is that our goal here is to develop our own immunological memory, which means making our own antibodies, but it takes some time to do that. It takes about 10 days after you're immunized to have appreciable amounts of antibodies. And so again, with these vaccine candidates, it's probably going to be a 2-dose regimen before we have more complete immunity, which won't be 100% for everybody either. And we have to keep that in mind. It's not going to 100% block all diseases, but I guess we'll have to wait to see which of these is the safest and which one shows to be the most efficacious. So I'm going to pass that on to Bob.
Thank you, Sarah. Bob, why don't you take these next 5 minutes and share?
All right, so here we go. So I too am going to take it from the perspective of the question that I get asked most often as a psychologist. And that question is whether or not not mine, but your response to COVID, your emotional response is normal. So there's a lot that can be said about that. But I'm going to just talk basically about how we respond to stress and how COVID fits into that. So let's start by talking about some of the stressors that are associated with COVID. So first, you have isolation from your primary community, your family perhaps. You have decreased meaningful contact. You have the possibility of a serious sickness or death. So this is a literal mortal threat. You have the financial strain that has gone with this since the economy has collapsed, and the uncertainty with various aspects of our basic needs, living, whether or not you can pay rent. So you have this survival threat. And a lot of our enjoyable activities have been removed. So, we have to watch sports in a different way. And for 6 months before, there was no sports, and all kinds of enjoyable activities are different. We have to eat in parking lots now if we want to go out to eat. And then if you're a parent and you have kids, your kids are freaking out. And they're running around trying to cope with this. And so that you have increased stress at home. You have tons of social and political turmoil that is bombarding our digital media day in and day out. We've had fires, the extreme heat, and the mosquitoes. And I don't know about you, but the mosquitoes were the last straw. I was like, I am done with this year. So, but then we got a few more things. So let's talk about how all of this is impacting people. And 25% of Americans reported moderate to severe stress, which I'm surprised it's that low, because the amount of stressors that I just listed off is a once in a lifetime cluster. So we have this multitude of existential threats, and so the anxiety that we're feeling with this tells us something. It tells us that we got to be on guard, that danger is looming somehow. So let's talk about the human condition. So we have a typical way that we have done life. Each of us has developmental habits. We have ways of coping that are usually developed to deal with predictable environmental stressors. So we work as humans based on equilibrium. So when life's demands don't exceed your mental habits or your resources, then you usually feel okay. So you have this equilibrium that we're constantly dealing with. So as stress increases, it depletes your existing resources. And resources can be friends, time alone, hobbies, good eating, exercise, all of these things. We have a storehouse of resources. So when we get stressed, what used to work doesn't work anymore once our resources are gone. And so if you think about, for the students here, and really actually the professors as well, the time in the semester when stress increases, well, you have a lot of things demanding your time. And so you feel anxious. You may describe yourself as being stressed or in a bad mood or freaking out or barely making it or whatever, right? What's happening is the demands have exceeded your resources. And so you're now out of equilibrium. All right, so is this a bad thing? Well, no, it depends on how you define bad, but no, it's a normal thing. And it's an opportunity for you to increase your internal and external resources and to become a more complex and resilient person. Stress, like we stress test economies, stress reveals areas in our life that may need more work. The body is designed in an amazing way. As stress increases, we have the opportunity to learn to cope better. Now, we introduced COVID, which the entire population has been, the resources have been maxed out. So there's not a living person who just from day one was thriving. I would find that hard to believe. So we get back to our initial question. So is what I'm feeling normal? Yes, but it's also uniquely you and incredibly difficult. Your body is using normal functions of adaptation to try to respond to an incredibly abnormal situation. So I will just give you a few thoughts on maybe what to do to cope better. One, be gracious and non-judgmental with yourself and your loved ones, knowing that everyone is stressed beyond their resources. The second thing, accept what you have before you as your current growth opportunity. The goal here is to go from surviving to actually improving. And your body is trying to adapt to this stressful environment. So you need to care for it through good sleep and good food and health and exercise and other fun things that will directly impact your mental fitness. Be patient. Your body is trying to improve itself. Be careful of worry. So there's enough stress right now for you to deal with that you don't need to add any more by worrying. So what is worry? Let's think for a quick second about that. Worrying is this illusion that you're solving a problem in the present moment that really has nothing to do with solving the problem. So if you have nothing that you can do to get control of your circumstances, worrying will just cause you more stress. If you're the type of person that has to worry about something, schedule time to worry and worry for a limited period of time, and only worry about those things you have control over. And then finally, struggle with this is expected. You should not do this alone. Humans are designed to adapt, to live, to survive, to thrive in community. You should not suffer alone. If you are suffering, you should seek help. Contact a mentor, a pastor, a friend, your physician, your mom, your dad, your son, anyone. And here at the university, we have the University Counseling Center. Everyone needs help dealing with this, and we'll get through this together. That's all I have. I'll turn it to Karen.
Thank you, Bob. Karen, why don't you go ahead and start your presentation?
All right. Thank you, Bob and Sarah, and also Brian. I am so happy to be part of this conversation and learn from my colleagues. I think COVID presents a call to embrace paradox and ambiguity, like a lot of life, only more so. And this call to embrace paradox and ambiguity is a biblical call. When you know the whole Bible, you see this, you internalize it, and you're inspired to sit with not knowing and multiple options like scientists do, and yet without retreating. So we go forward to try to understand and preserve life like God does, to work hard to preserve life. Our Christian choices during this very difficult time include relying on the Bible to know that we're in line with other faithful people who knew and trusted God, and to learn compassion and healthy fear, to join God in preserving life. The Bible provides multiple models to reflect upon and cope with trauma and disaster. It provides models of faith and faithing and healthy fear. So these include learning from others humbly, but also critically, listening to God and others, and accepting our emotions, like Bob just said, being kind to ourselves, and lamenting. And I'm going to stress lamenting a little more today. We have a lot to lament about losses that are so great, so incomprehensible. The statistics don't hit us like the anecdotes do. But the Bible also shows us how to hope for relief, for a safe vaccine, for more community and harmony among people, and comfort from God. And that's really a strong biblical message, is to go to God, rely on God, and learn to pray. Preserving life includes taking these necessary precautions that have been mentioned by our leaders. And we fear COVID because it's a fear-worthy villain. So we learn from the experts who have closely studied its migrations and mutations. They have the ability to are called to trust them because of the evidence that has been emerging. And we realize evidence changes all the time, and that's all good. Some examples of lament in the Bible that I want to turn to include Psalm 89, which is an agonized, honest questioning of God. I'd love to talk more about it because at the beginning of the psalm, it seems like a typical psalm of praising God, but in verse 38, there's an abrupt end where the psalmist, probably in exile, is challenging God, angry at God, and doesn't understand what's going on, and does not accept the blame for exile. Habakkuk and Lamentations are far lengthier treatises of questioning and struggling and mourning and lamenting. They model for us, go to God, harass God, impugn God, but never ignore God. Never be indifferent to God. So there's a lot of questions in these books and a lot of lament over loss. These prophets wrangle with God like Jacob did in Genesis 32 to emerge as Israel, one who struggles with God. Jacob emerged to represent the story of all Israel and the church, people who wrestle with God and with life. So choosing the model of lament and struggle is a Christian response to COVID. We ask, as the people of God, what's going on here? Can you help, God? Will you help? How can we help you? Struggling like this involves hope for relief. And we go to God because we expect help from God, which includes consulting experts. And the most important thing I want to leave today is the question, can we avoid avoiding God? I think as Christians, we struggle along with God to provide relief with others. I'm a strong proponent of cooperating with God, being partners with God. And God, throughout the Bible and then through the Holy Spirit, warns us against doing what harms us and what harms others. So we respond responsibly while we cry out in pain. Can we find ways to come together in spite of these enforced isolation practices through our questions and our prayers? Our typical theological interpretations and spiritual disciplines are challenged now. I have a lot of questions myself. But let us rely on the rock of our God, to remember God, to be grateful for past provisions and wisdom, and to flee to Scripture for wisdom in this way. If we do, we find that Scripture points us to God, and it shows us how to practice our faith. God is a rock that persists beyond this present age. One of our friends who suffers from cancer reminded us that we may die, but we will not be harmed. We're enfolded in God's fold. When we find ways to encourage each other and practice our faith, we make a way through these harsh, difficult, and lonely times. I think this calls for being creative in building community and ultimately to pray together to see God at work in us and through us and in others.
Thank you very much, Karen, for those words. Let me give you a few of my comments. Some questions were submitted early, and in regards to churches beginning the process of thinking about reopening. Some have already been opened, some are in the process of thinking about that. And so I want to preface first my comments by saying that ministers have a very difficult job without a pandemic. And the quick shift to online gatherings within our fractured political context has made it that almost every minister and church has been feeling pressure from two sides. So what is the church to do? What is a pastor to do? Well, I have no answers for you. All I have are some things maybe to reflect on. The complexity of each congregation's situation requires a lot of prayer and also its own communal discernment, right? But even though I don't have an answer, that doesn't stop a professor from talking, right? So I want to offer these two reflections that might aid us in discerning our worship, our in-person worship, and how should we look at that? My first reflection is tied to Scripture. At the beginning of the pandemic, I was reading the book of Jeremiah. and contemplating his temple sermon that outlines, much like Amos and other prophets, God's rejection of Judah's burning of expensive incense and elaborate festivals. Judah and Israel loved their worship. They loved their worship more than they loved their God and their neighbors. Yet the worship God was desiring was one that included justice, care for orphans, widows, and foreigners. And therefore, the worship God desires in the prophets is missional, risky, sacrificial. And this seems the opposite sometimes of many of our churches, which can be described as maintenance churches. And what people mean by a maintenance church is that over time, a church can settle into patterns of institutional life that turns the focus inward and tempts the people to become content with self-preservation. Many of these churches, unfortunately, seem to have little sense of mission beyond keeping the doors open. And so a maintenance church echoes, I think, in a way, the way in which the worship of Judah and Israel were described in the prophets. They were happy with what they were doing and comfortable. My second comment, the second reflection, is tied to an experience I had. 2 months into the pandemic, the world watched the devastating murder of George Floyd, which had followed that of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and many others. And the streets were filled with protests against racial injustice. Around the same time, and in the midst of all the fears of social distancing, the fears of social gathering, a student of ours in the seminary, Karen Taylor, who is the senior pastor of Heavenly Vision Church in Los Angeles, with her husband, Bishop Taylor, were planning a protest event and asked if I would join them. Now, the Taylors understood better than many others the risk of gathering. They saw friends die from the virus. But they also did not allow that to overwhelm their pursuit of what they knew was necessary and good. Everyone on that Sunday morning would social distance and wear masks. We gathered in the church courtyard that morning, and the first phrase that came out of Bishop Taylor's mouth was, "We are gathered here this morning for worship." For worship. He reiterated over and over that what we were doing was a worship service. Led by police escorts, we processed, maintaining social distance, up Broadway Avenue to the 77th Street Police Headquarters. As we processed away from the church building, pastors and deacons with megaphones would call out the name of someone who had been recently killed. And our response was, "Lord, bring justice." 100 names were called as we processed together, and we chanted out, "Lord, bring justice." We were worshiping up Broadway Avenue with cars honking and onlookers listening. When we arrived at the steps of the precinct, Bishop Taylor gave a short homily. He led us in a song, and then we were led in a communion liturgy that was birthed in prophetic imagination. During communion, we were told that we could either partake of the elements, or if we felt led, we could place the wafer of Jesus' broken body on the police precinct steps, and then take the juice that is Jesus' shed blood and spill it on those steps. After placing the body and blood of our Lord on these police steps as a prophetic witness to the shed blood and broken bodies of our African-American brothers, we prayed together. There, with wafers and juice littered on the police precinct steps, the worship service ended. These are my two reflections. As we discern now if or how to return to in-person services during this pandemic, I want to keep the prophets and the Taylors in mind. What if we saw the pausing of our in-person gatherings as an opportunity to evaluate our worship in light of the words of Jeremiah or Amos, in light of the racial injustice around us? Are we primarily maybe desiring to return to in-person gatherings because it's normal or because we are in love with our worship in the ways that Judah and Israel were? And can we learn from the Taylors that until we make the connection between the Lord's body and African American bodies on the street, our worship might be sour? Amos says, "Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps, but let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." Resuming in-person gatherings during this pandemic, with all the racial injustice being revealed on the streets and in the disproportionate death counts, is an opportunity to think about the church's worship, why we gather in person, and what we're doing. It offers opportunities for definition. And my hope is that we can learn to lean into the ways that the Taylors and the prophets understand worship in this period. Because if we go back to in-person services purely as an act of maintenance, so that we can keep the doors open, we might be missing an opportunity to hear the prophets. And so, that's not the only considerations to think about when you're opening up a church. But I cannot not say something about what we're experiencing, all of these different things at the same time. These have been, the racial injustice and worship and wanting to kind of worship and what we see as worship. I think those are things that all pastors, all churches have been. I've been encouraged by many churches who are engaging this in ways while they're still not in-person gatherings, worshiping in really robust justice ways. But I think they've thought through these questions well, and I think we all should do the same. So that finishes my my little comments here about this question. And this question was posed, like I mentioned, for this webinar. And I want to offer that question up to the rest of our panelists in regard to now as churches are thinking about reopening, social distancing, protocols, etc. What thoughts or comments might you have to help people who are maybe right in the middle of having to kind of make those negotiations?
Well, I'll have thought about this. My husband's a pastor of a church. I'm also an ordained elder and involved in our church. And one of the things that I think about when I think about this question is that churches are particularly prone to passing the virus because of our wonderful rituals of singing and being close to one another and eating and drinking the Lord's Supper together. So these are wonderful and needed in normal times, and we shake hands and we pass the peace. And these activities, unfortunately, do load up our neighbors with the virus if we happen to have it. Masks are good, just social distance is good, but they interfere with these particular rituals. So I think that we trust our state and county because they're attempting to preserve life. And I don't think we should join religious groups who are putting this state under pressure to minimize the guidelines and talk about religious freedom, because religious freedom isn't religious freedom to die or to sicken other people.
Those are good comments. Bob or Sarah, do you have any maybe additional comments?
I think that at my church, I don't get the sense that people are really anxious to get back together for a lot of the reasons I think that Karen, you mentioned. And another thing, once we stopped meeting in person, the church opened the sanctuary to some people who are experiencing homelessness. So they've been living in the church for months now. And we've been taking care of them, and there's been a real call at my church to take care of the poor and those who are experiencing financial hardship. So I think that's part of it too, where we know that when we go back, it will displace the people who are living there right now. It's going to happen, but I think we're reluctant.
Yes. So I think this question goes to the argument of, should we get back together in our normal lives because of all the harm that it's doing to us otherwise, right? That's usually how I see it phrased, and I've seen it phrased, on social media that way, like, our economy's getting devastated, and all the mental health issues, and those are real issues, no doubt. But I think that the health and safety of the vulnerable are of primary concern, and Our church has a number of homeless individuals that regularly attend, and I can't imagine responsibly holding church, in a face-to-face environment when there's a lot of people who, are incredibly vulnerable. So I personally am content with the decision that our church has taken to stay virtual. And there's been a lot of fun things about the virtual. I actually talk to people I don't talk to because we do breakout groups. And I've gotten to know a whole bunch of folks that I never knew before. So it's been great in that sense.
This is another question. There are various perceptions, and it's kind of tied because how we've been told to respond, how public health has kind of been communicated, shifts and changes over the time when we're first getting to know what is this virus, right? And because of that, some people have maybe lost confidence because we're told maybe do this now and change here. So Sarah, this might be more a question for you, but can you talk a little bit about the process of science, of learning about a virus? I think that would be really helpful.
Sure. I think we've all been witnessing that. We've seen the process of science play out before our very eyes. As soon as this virus was identified, okay, it's in the coronavirus family, it's related to the virus that caused SARS. And so we have a body we have some facts or we have some information and we start to make assumptions. Maybe it's very similar. And then we find out it's actually not similar. Initially, I don't know if you guys remember this, but the virus that causes SARS stays in the respiratory tract. Well, this one, SARS-CoV-2 that causes COVID, it actually can leave the respiratory tract, get into the bloodstream, get into urine, get into stool. I mean, that's something that had to be discovered. It really couldn't be predicted. But it's almost like we have these models and then we see this is a new thing. So let's take the models, the things that we know, and let's see if they hold true for this virus. And some did, and some didn't. With our diagnostic tests, we did what we typically do. We do PCR, we look at the genetics, but that meant that we needed the sequence of the virus's its RNA, but genome first. And then all the countries in the world did, okay, now we'll take this information, we're going to make a diagnostic test. We can do it quickly because we know how to do that. We do it routinely for other viral infections, other types of diagnostics. So there's some of that where it's like very quickly you apply everything you know to this new situation and then you make some assumptions. And if they don't hold true, you got to change. When you get the evidence, you need to change trajectory. And that is it's par for the course in science. And I think that I wasn't appreciating how disconcerting that would be for a lot of people. So in my class, I was teaching microbiology when we stopped meeting at APU. And students were asking a lot of questions, and I just said, these are great questions. We don't have the answers. This is how science moves forward. You probe the depths of what you don't know, and it pushes forward the science. And I kind of was stressing with my students, it's really important to know what you know and what you don't know. It's totally fine for us to say we don't know something in science. It's totally fine for us to switch gears when there's new evidence. That's expected. It's very different from politics, where if you change your mind, you're a flip-flopper. But that's not going to hurt your career as a scientist. There's a kind of flexibility and I think a humility, an intellectual humility that we learn in the process of science. But what it always means, though, is no scientist is ever going to say, I'm 100% sure about that. We always keep it open for new evidence that might change the way we see something. And that, I think, sometimes comes across to the public as no confidence or a complete lack of confidence. Whereas we're dealing in things like, 95% confidence or 99% confidence, but we're never going to say 100%. I think this applies to a lot of other scientific findings. I'll say climate change too, and this has been one of the, I don't know if criticisms, but explanations for why people were really skeptical about climate science and greenhouse gas emissions caused by humans is because scientists are always going to couch it in a language of a little bit of skepticism, I'm going to leave a little bit open to see what is further down the line. I'm not going to say with 100% confidence this is what the temperature will be in 50 years, because there might be inputs of greenhouse gases that we haven't considered, that we haven't learned about, we don't know about. So I don't know if I can make people feel better about that. I can just say, as a scientist, I expect that that's normal. And to Bob's point, that's actually not a source of stress for me, but I'm realizing it is for a lot of people. Not having that certainty just on a medical level is really stressful for some people.
I'm glad you said that, Sarah, because I've been extremely frustrated watching people on the news and then hearing people on posts who say, well, we don't have to do masks or we don't have to social distance because scientists just don't know. They change all the time. No, but actually they know a lot, and we can trust their guidelines. Even if something gets tweaked down the road, we can't say we don't know, because there is a lot that we do know.
Yeah, and if I could just circle back for 1 second too, that's so right, Karen. Another thing too that I'm seeing is, if you say something like, well, wearing a mask lowers transmission, then people will say like, yeah, but it doesn't guarantee. And that's another thing where it's like, but we're not dealing with all or nothings here. It's not either you wear a mask and it has to prevent 100% of viral spray, or you wear nothing. It's somewhere in between. I'm finding that too, where there's kind of like a discomfort with lowering risk as opposed to either completely eliminating it or, I don't know, completely taking the risk, I guess.
Bob, why don't you maybe respond to that? In some ways, it feels very polarizing, right? But there's also a sense of kind of maybe when we're told to prevent something, at the same time, we're being told to fear something, right? And how are we negotiating, taking away resources to help us with fears and those types of things, some of the things that you talked about?
Yeah. I mean, that is an incredibly complex question that gets into sociology, anthropology, but I mean, I'll give you my opinion, right? That's, this won't be, like ironclad, but I think that, I mean, so we're seeing a lot of behavior that's increased in frequency. Conflicts are increasing, substance abuse is increasing. So we're seeing a lot of coping, what I would call like unhelpful coping. And I think we're seeing that too, politically and religiously, that we're looking for our community because it's been taken away from us, right? And so that's how I see this. I see, I try and put a positive spin on the folks who really rally behind, let's open church, let's defy the state, etc. They want their community ultimately, right? Those who have turned the mask into an issue where I want to be certain about it, I don't. Well, we're not certain about driving cars, right? I mean, so we're not being intellectually honest or consistent at all, right? We're doing things to make us feel better, and I think it comes down to trying to cope, right? Trying to cope with stress, trying to manage an unmanageable situation, and people, kind of, really get out there on a limb, and don't have good reasons. So I don't know. I've tried to appreciate the challenges that even what I think are unreasonable people are facing. Right? They're trying to get along the best that they can. Right? And it bothers me, of course. I feel angry when I see some of these news videos, but I don't know. Maybe they would be angry at me in the way that I'm living my life right now. So I don't know.
I mean, it gets to that. What was your first point? Be gracious and non-judgmental.
Trying.
And this kind of gets to Karen's point about embracing the ambiguity. And I don't know if there's more you could say about that, Karen, too, but you're saying that theologically we are called to embrace some ambiguity, and this is good practice, I guess.
Yes, I just feel like the Bible is full of that, and people try to go to the Bible for a rule book, for answers. I mean, even in some cases, to see that COVID was predicted there. I mean, there's lots of crazy stuff out there. The Bible isn't going to address COVID because COVID didn't exist and it wasn't an issue. So we can't look to the Bible or rely on the Bible for those kind of things, or even predictive prophecies. But we can rely on the Bible to show us that life is difficult and that we do have options. But there are good options. There may not be perfect options, but they're good enough options. And so, living with ambiguity takes a lot of maturity, but we're called to that.
We've got some questions that are coming in. I think we've spoken a little bit to face masks, but this one question is in regard to somebody who said that many people argue that those who are at risk should stay home. Those who are at lesser risk should be able to go without a mask. And they're saying, well, how do we converse around that? I mean, is there a ranking list of comorbidities or anything like that we should play into our equation about how we socially distance, how we do prevention? Is there one size fits all prevention, or is there ways that this can be modeled because of different information? You want to take that?
If we knew everything about our own genetics and our own immune systems, we could probably make those predictions, but I don't think we could ever have an algorithm. Well, maybe we could someday, but I don't think we're at the place where we could have an algorithm that would take every factor into account. So I think that's difficult. And I guess one question would be, would that be a priority? Do we want to spend our resources or our time addressing that question when there are other questions?
Yeah.
Maybe we want to work on a treatment, maybe we want vaccines, I don't know. But that's just what's kind of coming up in my mind.
I guess in some ways, all four of us are very privileged, right? We come from a very privileged circumstances. We have our jobs. We can do our jobs from a distance. And we probably, even in our homes, we probably have distance. We have spaces that we can kind of duck away into and do meetings. That's a small percentage of a lot of people's experiences. And when you're asked to do certain things like social distancing, stay at home and avoid maybe large crowds, maybe your home is a large crowd, and especially if you're going to work. How do we do that? I mean, especially from the Latino community here in LA, and we've seen, and some of that's kind of socioeconomic, some systemic issues, right, in regards to healthcare and access to that. But some of that, I mean, some of the things that we're talking about in regards to prevention are sometimes unrealistic for these communities. And how might we, so taking one kind of size fits all, is there even for these communities ways that kind of, I know not everything's data or algorithmed, right? Psychologists are talking about the silent pandemic or something. I hear this on like NPR. There's a silent pandemic of depression, right? And other numbers that aren't being counted in the same way. So like is it, and I think this is what some of the church's pushback has been, right? Is it state says it, we do it? Or are these other voices, other scientists, right? Other scientists that might have different opinions about how to handle this? How do we negotiate all that stuff and not get lost into kind of like conspiracy theories, or there's so much to think about. That's a lot, but somebody respond.
Yeah, that was a lot of questions there.
Yeah.
I was thinking to the question that came in, which is much easier, the call, not just the Bible, common sense says we're responsible to the vulnerable and the marginalized, but you're bringing up the much trickier cases where people absolutely have to go to work. Their house is full of people, including very vulnerable people. But the excuse is the comment, let those who are vulnerable stay home and let the rest of us play or work or do whatever we want. I mean, that just it seems so self-centered and extremely unchristian. But your other questions are just the ones that we wrestle with and keep us awake at night. Brian. They're really, really hard. I mean, some people just plain have to go to work or they won't survive.
All right, maybe Sarah, like, how do you trust whose science?
How do I trust whose science? Well, some of the gold standards for science is peer review. So that's part of the process. It was interesting because in the very beginning, like February, there were news reports that were referencing some papers, and when I would go look up the papers, they weren't peer reviewed yet. Like they had just been submitted. And so those are the ones where I'm like, well, I don't know yet because they haven't even gone through reviewers yet. And so, to me, I was like, is it responsible to be even publishing in the newspaper things that we ourselves as scientists wouldn't quite accept yet as good evidence?
Can you just maybe briefly comment on what is peer reviewed?
Oh, peer review. If you publish a piece, you have other scientists who are asked. It's part of our professional duty. You get called on to be reviewers for papers. It's part of your professional duty, and you look at the paper critically and look at some of the flaws maybe in experimental design, and you give your recommendations to a journal and say, yes, I think you should publish this. No, you should reject it, or you could publish it, but there might need to be revisions. And people who are peer reviewing may say, hey, I think before this is published, you should do experiment X, Y, and Z because you haven't ruled out these factors. So that is kind of part of the process where we don't publish things without having other scientists look at our work and critique it. And really, when you go into that mindset, you are being as critical as you possibly can be. You are as skeptical as you possibly can be. So that, going back to your conspiracy theory, there's sort of part of being a scientist is being extremely skeptical of the work. But it makes us feel better when we know other scientists who usually are anonymous have critiqued it and had a say in whether it gets published or not. It becomes part of the body of scientific knowledge.
I mean, that speaks to the importance of education, knowing what sources to be trusted, doing research in this time, because there's lots of things floating around on the internet, lots of things on social media that get traction. And so how do we check up on those? And peer review, I think, is helpful. Thank you for that. We've only got a few minutes left, so I'm going to just throw out one more question to the panelists, and if you can maybe answer maybe in a minute or so, is as committed believers, how do you personally think about God and faith during this time? What are your thoughts?
So maybe I'll just start, since my answer probably will be less profound than the theologians here. So I'll just, it's more practical. I've tried to view this as an opportunity to improve my mental fitness. And that includes spiritual practices and the habits of daily life and reassessing everything that I've done so far. How I live my life and things that are important. So it's been in many ways an opportunity for deep self-reflection and what's important, and how I'm going to live maybe the next 30 years.
Thanks.
We want practical. Thank you. I've mostly been in that world of struggle and question and lament. There's a woman whose father was killed that lives in San Francisco. He was killed by COVID. And she's very distressed over the people that receive the designer drugs and all of the things that Sarah talked about. It's just immediately, because that wasn't available to her father, and her father was practicing what the politicians at the time were telling him to do, and he died. And she's starting this very week lament. Her name's Kristen Oropeza. I am there. I'm lamenting. I watch the stories of individuals who have died from COVID and mourn for them and for those losses. And I just feel like I need to live here for a while.
I think my answer is a blend of both of yours. I've also had more space, more time to read, but also to read about things that are making me lament even more. I've been thinking more about what is the church's role in racism in our country. What is the white church's role? And that's hard to face. There's also lament there too. But I'm embracing it as a growth period, I guess. And my prayer has been kind of from the beginning, like, God, what can I learn from this? How can I grow? And then my other prayer right from the beginning was like, help me look for ways to serve other people and be generous. And that has continued kind of to be maybe a mantra. I guess a mantra is a good way to say it.
Mm-hmm.
I think lament is a pattern. It is kind of in the interrogative mood. It's asking God questions and continuing to kind of ask God questions. And I think that's been part of this time. It's also, I've been reading a little bit of Julian of Norwich, who lived during kind of the Great Plague, where over 50% of people were wiped out. Lots of social unrest, peasants mowed down by kind of the elite classes. And she has these visions where she kind of holds this little hazelnut and looks at it as the world in God's palm. And she has this idea that all is love, that even in the midst of all of the suffering that she is witnessing, some of the things that she describes very graphically, she still holds on knowing God is love, even in the midst of all of this suffering. And I think it's been a good word for me to hold on to, that even though I'll challenge, I'll be angry, upset, lament with God, there's still this hope, this sense that this is God's story. This is part of it. Don't know how it is. There's lots of questions about that, but it's God's story, and in the end, He reigns. And that's been something that I need to remind myself often. Thank you, all three of you, for taking this time. Thank you, those of you who took this lunch hour to kind of be with us. We didn't get to all the questions, but hopefully we touched on most of your concerns and thoughts. And with that, I want to just ask Karen if you would close us out with a word and a prayer.
Yes. This is from Eugene Peterson, Earth and Altar, which was written in the early 80s. Be still and know. Civilization is littered with unsolved problems, baffling impasses. The best minds of the world are at the end of their tether. The most knowledgeable observers of our condition are badly frightened. The most relevant contribution that Christians can make at these points of impasse is the act of prayer. Determined, repeated, leisurely meetings with the personal and living God. New life is conceived in these meetings. Let's bow for prayer together and pray that we can see God at work through us and in us and in others. Lord, our leaders are baffled and cast about for responses to this trying time. Not only do we have the plague of COVID, we have great fires and hurricanes, flooding, and other effects of global warming. We have a recognition of racial and other social injustice. We want to cooperate with you, to be partners with you in fighting COVID and helping one another in the whole world. We remember and we are grateful for the provisions and wisdom you've given in the past. We want to avoid idolizing anything or anyone. We seek your face. Help us to listen to you and the wisdom that comes through research, people earnestly seeking to use their gifts and training for good. Above all, Lord, help us to love our sisters and brothers all around the world, your little ones, the least of these to whom Christ constantly pointed. We ask this, Lord, as we are gathered together in your name. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. And peace.